All right, hang with me. We got a lengthy introduction to get you up to speed on an important Canadian issue. On October 17, Telus shareholders are going to be casting their votes on the company's proposal of collapsing voting and non-voting shares into one class. Now, the company said they wanted to do this to enhance liquidity and extend voting rights to all shareholders. That's great. Telus thought this was going to be a routine vote, but instead it's turned into a 6-month battle with a New York hedge fund who is fiercely opposing the conversion on a one-for-one basis. Their name is Mason. You might have heard of them. Mason says that voting shares should receive a premium over non-voting. Let's go through a quick timeline, get everybody up to speed. On February 21st, Telus made their proposal to collapse the shares. On April 10th, Mason disclosed their stake in Telus, which almost stood at 19% of the company. And then on April 23rd, they said they were going to oppose the vote, saying that a premium should be paid, and traditionally has been in this type of transaction. On May 2nd, Telus asked the British Columbia Securities Commission to intervene, saying that since Mason is both long and short the stock, meaning they have a position in the voting and the non-voting, they actually have no net economic exposure, and they introduced the phrase empty voting. BCSC said no. That led us to May 9th. Telus dropped the share restructuring, fearing perhaps that they were going to lose the vote. And then on August 22nd, Telus reproposes it, but makes the threshold easier. So, who's right? Here to debate the issues at hand, we're joined by Carol Hansel, a partner at Davies, who was retained by Telus to look at the issue specifically of empty voting, and Richard Leblanc, Associate Professor of Law, Governance and Ethics at York University, who recently wrote that Telus's board is disregarding interests of one class of shareholder over another and potentially has a conflict of interest. Let's start clearly by just stating, Richard, you came out with a paper that seemed to be in favor of Mason. Do you have any affiliation with Mason? Do you have any business relationship with Mason?
I have no business relationship. I wrote the blog and have been in contact with both Mason and Telus. Mason has said that I have been retained in the past as an expert witness in cases, and Mason has said in full transparency that they may retain me if this reaches the oppression stage.
All right, well, let's start with the conflict of interest that you brought up. Why do you think they're misrepresenting the interests of their shareholders, or at least a class of their shareholders?
The Ontario Securities Commission came out in 2008 and moved towards a more objective standard of independence. Independence for directors and independence for advisors. And when you tip in, according to reports that I've read, the share units and the options of the directors and of the senior management team in respect of the one-to-one collapse, the directors on the special committee stand to gain a benefit of about $120,000. Directors on the not on the committee but on the board stand to gain a benefit of approximately $80,000. The CEO stands to benefit in the neighborhood of 1.3 million, and the senior management team stands to benefit 7.2 million. From a reasonable person standpoint, not from a subjective standpoint, the point I made in my blog is that it seems to me that it is reasonable to make an inference that there is a benefit both to the directors and to the senior management team on the collapse. And in that respect, looking to the 2008 policy, the conflict of interest guideline that the OSC put out, it ultimately withdrew it right before the financial crisis. But the OSC was very clear that if there is a benefit to the board, directly or indirectly, then there's certain obligations that kick in, including the retention of independent advisors, fairness opinions, retention of documents, and that sort of thing. So my first point in the blog really was that, and I'm not impugning the integrity or independence of any existing director. This is not a subjective view. It's more of an objective view. That,
all right, well, let me stop you there, because I think a
Sure.
lot of people would look at you and say, it's hard to say you're not impugning subjectivity when you say there's a potential conflict of interest. So let me throw it over to you, Carol. What do you think of his notion that this is all being done and there's a conflict of interest underlying all of it?
So I think I think people frequently confuse take an interest and automatically say, well, if there's an interest, there must be a conflict. So as a matter of governance practice these days, shareholders really insist that officers and directors have a position, have skin in the game, own shares in the company. So that's a given that the officers and directors will have a position. The officers and directors of Telus don't have a material position. They're not controlling the company. It's it's logical that if something happens to the shares, it will also happen to their shares. But they don't have any particular interest beyond being fairly minor stakeholders. I mean, when you look at the balance of shares that they have, there are balances of, they've got common shares, they've got non-voting shares. And so do they have an interest? Yes, shareholders insist that they have an interest. Do they have a conflict? Is their interest any different than any other shareholders? No.
Let's go on that notion of interest for a second, because one of the issues that you bring up is that Mason shouldn't really be able to hold up this entire transaction because they don't have an economic interest in this, right? Net, they really don't care about the company as much as just profit. Why is that wrong?
That's actually that's a very good way to look at it, because I think what you have to do is separate the two issues. I mean, there's first of all the issue of being able to acquire votes in the marketplace through a variety of different instruments, and that process, or the fact of those instruments, nothing wrong with it. There are good and valid business reasons for derivatives and short sales and all of those sorts of things. So let's put that over here as being benign. What we have to look at is what effect can that have on the governance process, because we assume that when shareholders come to the table to make a decision, they're making a rational decision in their own economic interest. If you take the economic interest...
Isn't seeking profit on a collapse of a trade an economic interest, or on the flip side, making sure you get paid a premium that others historically have got?
Economic interest in the company.
But as a shareholder, do I need legally to have an economic interest that matches up with the company's economic interest, or can't it just be mine?
Because to Randy's point, shorting a stock period would basically say you don't have an economic interest in the company.
That's quite true. And so legally, yes, absolutely, it's quite possible to do that. The problem is that the law has not caught up with all of the fancy things that we can do with shares in the marketplace now. So the whole governance theory is based on the idea that a vote is attached to an economic interest. We can now synthetically decouple that, and so the economic interest is over here, but somebody who's got no economic interest in the company is able to have a major say in what happens to that company. I would think that the rest of the shareholders who do have an interest are going to say, well, I mean, what's going on?
Richard, do you agree with that? Do you think there is no economic interest because they're net, long and short, perhaps, versus non?
One could argue that it is not empty voting because they're longing voting shares and they're shorting non-voting shares. And in borrowing a share, you're not voting twice. And there is academic evidence in the Journal of Financial Economics from Duke University that, in fact, empty voting is a good thing. It makes, under certain conditions, the whole system more efficient. Carol does have a very good point, and her firm authored a great guideline on the problems with empty voting. So there's two sides to this story, but with one side is that shareholders can act out of self-interest, and they don't owe duties to other shareholders, where the board cannot. I mean, the Supreme Court of Canada was very clear, and this is my point on oppression, is that it cannot treat one shareholder unfairly and disregard the economic interests of that shareholder.
But that's not the case. That's not the case with Telus.
But Richard,
well, you could make the case. I made the case in my blog.
Well. So how do you say that's not the case with Telus then? I mean, it's one thing to say, what do you back that up with? He's clearly sitting there saying it is the case.
But
there was a premium of 4 to 5%.
So right. So that's what we're discussing here. We're discussing the premium, correct? Because normally with a voting share, you would have a premium, and what they're saying here is no premium. So how does that play out?
Well, the point I made is that by giving dissenting votes to non-voting shareholders that they didn't have, by lowering the threshold from 2/3 to 50% for the voting shareholders, and by not acknowledging the premium that has historically been paid. When you look at the Supreme Court decision under oppression, it looks at past practices and it looks at actions taken by management. So my point in the blog was that it could give rise to unfair disregard of the interests of one class of shareholders at the expense of another. And I'd be interested in Carol's point of view on that.
Thanks. So I think when you look at the Telus situation, the one-for-one exchange ratio is enshrined in the articles, right? When the foreign restriction goes away, that's the expectation. That's what's built in. The fact that the common shares have traded at a bit of a premium is a historical fact. When you look at the way the market has treated the transaction, both the common shares and the non-voting shares have gone up in value.
Equally.
Which suggests that all of the shareholders are happy with the idea that there's going to be increased liquidity, easier to finance. It's simply going to be better for the corporation. So the fact that the non-voting shares increase in value is not taking anything away from the common shareholders. they're happy about it too. Their value has gone up as well.
Well, the voting shareholders would argue that, in fact, they're being diluted from 100 to 54%, and they're not being given the premium that historically has been given to them.
I'm not aware that the common shareholders, other than perhaps
guys,
one
we got
is making
about a month till the vote. A little longer. We're going to have you back. In the meantime, we got commercials to get to, I guess.
Thank you both very much for joining us today.
Carol
Hansel, partner at Davies, who was retained by Telus to look at the issue of empty voting, and Richard Leblanc, associate professor of law and governance at York University. Stay with us. More Market Sense coming up right after the break.